Okay, I think we can start. So welcome everyone again to this IAAP Nordic Chapters webinar. My name is Eva Björk and I am the new but temporary project manager for the chapter. It's because I'm carrying a little one in my belly, so I will disappear quite soon. And that's why we will find a permanent solution, permanent manager after the summer. But I'm really happy to be with you today. And I'm really happy that so many of you wanted to join us during this webinar. It's the first one in our series that's now before the summer and then will continue after the summer during the autumn. This webinar is about WAI-ARIA, how and when to use it. It's not me who's gonna tell you everything about WAI-ARIA. It's Timo Ermark from EFICode. But I just thought I will introduce myself first and tell you a little bit about the housekeeping. So we will use Q&A function during the webinar. So please, if you have any questions to Timo, write them in Q&A so he can take them and answer them after his presentation. As you probably noticed as well, both your microphones and camera have been disabled. But if you would prefer to ask your question verbally, please use the raise hand function in Zoom. During this webinar, we use as well automatic captions. So if you need those, please use the CC button in Zoom. So I think we can start. So I will leave the floor to Timo. But yes, one more thing I wanted to tell you. The next webinar in the series will be on the 16th of June. And it will be hosted by Malin Hammarberg from Sigma Technology Digital Solution. And Malin will tell you about how to test accessibility in iOS and Android apps. So it's going to be very interesting and very knowledgeable webinar for sure. So stay tuned. More information will come to you next week, both via email and as well. You will be able to find more information on our website and via social media. And now, please, Timo, I leave the floor to you.
Yes, thank you. And good afternoon, everyone, to this webinar on WAI-ARIA and how and when to use that. First, some information about today's agenda. So I'm going to start with a brief introduction into technical accessibility and where WAI-ARIA is, what role does it have in the whole accessibility domain. And then I'm going to tell what actually ARIA is, so about the specification and the techniques that it provides for web content creation and development. And then I'm going to tell you also about how to apply these techniques, when can you use ARIA, when not to use ARIA. And then I'm going to give you some practical examples on how to apply ARIA techniques to your websites and web applications. And then finally, we're going to leave some time to answer your questions if you have any. And as Eva already told you, questions are very welcome. So you can use the Q&A functionality in Zoom to write down the questions, and then I will answer those after the presentation. That's probably the easiest regarding time management and so forth. So we're definitely going to answer the questions afterwards. But first, I should probably start by introducing myself. My name is Timo Övermark. I come from EFICode. I work there by the title of Digital Accessibility Lead. I have a technical background. I have an engineering degree in computer science, and then also a master's degree on human-computer interaction. And I've been working as a designer developer in the third sector in Finland in an NGO, the Finnish Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, for a bit over 10 years. And there I actually started my career in accessibility, doing design and development and user testing with people with different kinds of disabilities. And that taught me a lot about the technical implementation part of websites and applications and games and so forth. And now I've been at Efficode for a bit over 3 years. So my work days usually nowadays are filled by doing trainings, accessibility audits, accessibility consultation, some use testing also. We have a team of 25 UX professionals in our UX research team at Efficode, and we do a lot of different types of user research for our customers. So we do usability testing, usability expert evaluation, all kinds of audits, consultation, trainings regarding accessibility, and anything that any company would need help with regarding accessibility. So that's a bit about the background that I'm coming from. So starting with what accessibility is regarding technical things and a bit different aspects to accessibility regarding the technical implementation, and what role does WAI-ARIA techniques play in that. So as you all know, accessibility means that any web service or any kind of service actually should be usable for everyone, and everyone should have access to digital services on an equal basis, because it's an equality issue, but it does make sense very much to companies and organizations who develop websites and web applications to develop their services so that they're as usable as possible for a broad group of people and a diverse group of people, so that it's using the services is as pleasant as possible. And also that people with any types of disabilities or any difficulties in using the service from due to any environmental or any factors, different kinds of devices and so forth. And that's why accessibility is an important aspect of the web. In my trainings, I have usually presented accessibility from the perspective of the web accessibility guidelines, because that's a good way of approaching accessibility, especially from the perspective of people who develop web services. And the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines contain 4 principles. The website or application should be perceivable, the content should be perceivable, the information presented in the service and the UI and the UI functionalities should be perceivable, so that all people who are using the service can get the information that's presented in the service and can use the user interface. So meaning, regardless of any types of sensory impairments, for example, they can get all information and get all information about the how to use the user interface also. Then the UI should be operable, meaning that UI components and, for example, navigational mechanisms should be operable using any types of input devices, a regular mouse, the keyboard, any other input devices, assistive technologies, and so forth. Then the information in the service and also the UI operation must be understandable. So all the content must be presented in a way that's understandable for a broad group of people. And also the UI must be understandable. So you must be able to determine how to operate the UI. And also there shouldn't be any surprises when using the UI. So there shouldn't be any unexpected changes in the view, for example, or any unexpected pop-ups coming on screen and things like that. And then the fourth principle about the content being robust enough, meaning that the code behind the web service should be robust enough and should be implemented in a way that it works with different kinds of devices, different types of user agents, different types of input devices, different types of assistive technologies. So it basically means that you should use your technologies that you are relying upon when developing the service, that you use them in a way that's as compatible as possible with a wide range of different kinds of devices, so that all users, if they use the service with their laptop or desktop computer or a tablet device, mobile device, any assistive technologies attached to their devices and so forth. Then from a bit another perspective, here's a picture from the WAI website from the accessibility fundamentals and components of web accessibility. The landscape in which web services are being developed and published online, the landscape is a bit different regarding from the perspective of people who are developing the service and people who are using the service. So in this picture, the web content is the most essential part here. So web content should be presented in a way that's accessible to all users and as big user group and as possible. And the users are using, they have their own devices, they have their own user agents, so browsers, media players, anything that they might use to access the service. They also might be using assistive technologies, they might be using different types of input devices, they might have an older computer and older versions of the web browsers, or they might have a brand new device. And the web content should work with all those devices that the users might have. And from development perspective and from the perspective of people who are authoring the content, the tools that they are using, the authoring tools, content management systems, web site platforms, server platforms, any tools that they are using when they are developing the content, so evaluation tools, accessibility audit tools, automatic evaluation tools, and so forth. Any technologies that they are using to get the content online affect how what they can actually do regarding accessibility, what type of techniques they can use, especially content management systems and UI frameworks and so forth might have an effect on what can you actually do with the content and what types of techniques can you use when developing web content. And all this must be taken into account when developing web services. So following the web content accessibility guidelines and making sure that your web content is following the web content accessibility guidelines is a very good thing, and it's actually essential to follow the web content accessibility guidelines to make your content accessible overall. So following the web content accessibility guidelines helps creating accessible web content using authoring tools that conform to the authoring tool accessibility guidelines helps creating accessible content. And the users should be using browsers and user agents that are following the user agent accessibility guidelines. But regarding web content, the web content accessibility guidelines are essential here. Regarding technologies that you might be using when developing the web service and the technologies that you're relying upon, you need to make sure that you use these in a way that guarantees accessible content. So you should be using HTML in a way that, or HTML techniques so that the end result is accessible. You should use ARIA to enhance your HTML and CSS JavaScript based implementation, and all the other technologies or technologies that you're using should be used in a way that follows the web content accessibility guidelines. When using WAI-ARIA, and the aim in using WAI-ARIA is to make the web content more accessible, and especially because websites and web applications are heavily based on the visual layout and visual appearance of the UI. And that's how most users who are using a web service are getting information about the content and the UI, and the UI communicates how the UI works and where you are on the website, what's your location on the website, what different types of structures they are, what's the meaning of different parts of a web page. Those kinds of things rely on the visual appearance. But for a screen reader user who's browsing the web based on what they hear online, so the screen reader tells the users what elements are on the website. Their good structure and good markup with the structure helps. So you should mark up all the structures so that the screen reader can tell their users that, for example, this is a navigation menu, and this is the main content part, and this is a heading, this is a image, and so forth. Also, if you have any more complex functionalities online in your website, you should make sure that your custom components are accessible. So if you have complex widgets, for example, a combo box or autofill or automatic search functionality that gives suggestions on search terms, for example, these should be implemented in a way that's accessible for screen reader users. And also compatibility with different screen readers, different browsers, different browser versions, that's important for screen reader compatibility. Following common patterns, implementation patterns, and also ARIA patterns that I'm going to present you later on, that's also important. And keyboard compatibility and keyboard access is also essential for people who use a screen reader, because especially on a desktop computer and on a laptop, a screen reader is operated using the keyboard. So all the functionalities should be available via keyboard interface. And that's also essential for people who use a screen reader. And most ARIA techniques are ARIA is not aimed specifically at screen reader use, but that's probably the most important thing regarding why you would actually want to use ARIA techniques to make it more compatible with screen reader users and screen readers and different ways of presenting the content. So what is ARIA actually? It's a specification by the W3C. ARIA comes from, it's an abbreviation from Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And it contains techniques for making your website more accessible and especially more compatible with different types of assistive technologies. And it's usually used when HTML is not sufficient and HTML implementation doesn't give you the tools that you would want to use when presenting online content, and especially when developing more complex functionalities to your website, or if you're developing a web application, you would quite probably need ARIA techniques to describe the content so that it's accessible for different kinds of assistive technologies. For example, if you have any tab controls or drop-down menus, accordions, dynamic changes in the content, then you would need WAI-ARIA techniques. And ARIA works on top of HTML code. So in practice, using ARIA techniques is adding stuff to your HTML code. So HTML markup contains tags that describe web content, and usually ARIA is applied by applying different attributes to your HTML tags. So for example, assigning roles to HTML elements. There are widget roles for implementing different types of UI widgets. There are landmark roles for marking up sections of content on your page. And then there are ARIA attributes which describe the content and describe different states of UI elements, different properties of UI elements, giving information to the user about how these things work and what's the current state, what's current value for a user, for an input element, for example. And these kinds of things are applied on top of HTML code. And first, I usually start when talking about ARIA. This is a very good and very important quote from the ARIA guide. No ARIA is better than bad ARIA. And it essentially means that you should know what you're doing. You shouldn't just sprinkle these ARIA attributes around and then hope that they make your website more accessible. You definitely should know what you're doing, and not doing it just to make sure, but actually know what you're doing. Because using ARIA, when you apply for a role to an element, for example, you give a promise that you implement the component based on the ARIA specification. So it's a promise that if you assign a role to an element, it contains also the other elements. For example, if the specification requires that you must have certain child elements with the element, or it must have keyboard access, for example, you need to change attribute values based on the state of the element, for example. So it's a promise that you will follow the specification. So when using ARIA, you should closely follow the specification. And the other reason is that ARIA can both cloak and enhance, meaning that it can provide important additional semantics to your content so that it can be presented using assistive technologies so that screen readers can tell, for example, about different states and different roles of components. But it can also override native semantics from your existing HTML code. So if you don't know what you're doing, you can also, for example, unintentionally hide content from assisted technologies if you don't apply the techniques according to the specification. So you need to be careful and know what you're doing when using ARIA. This is a nice analogy by my colleague Daniel. Using ARIA is like picking wild mushrooms. So the same with mushrooms, you should know which ones to pick and how to use them, so that because bad things can happen if you don't know which mushrooms are edible and which are not. So the same with ARIA. So you should know what you're doing and only use the techniques that you know how to use, and you should know that you're not breaking anything while using these. Then when should you use ARIA? So when to apply ARIA techniques and when not to apply ARIA techniques. This is a bit strange start for this presentation, telling first that you probably shouldn't use ARIA if you don't absolutely need to, but you definitely should use native HTML UI elements if possible, because the native HTML elements have all the semantics and keyboard compatibility built in, and the compatibility with older devices, different assistive technologies, different screen reader versions, different types of devices. The compatibility is best when using native HTML components. But yeah, so you should use native HTML whenever possible. And then while using HTML elements, if you have different types of functionalities that you build on top of the elements, so you use ARIA to enhance HTML code. So for example, you describe certain states. For example, in a button, you can, if it's a button that can, it's an expandable button that reveals information and can be collapsed also. So you can use ARIA to describe that functionality. Or you can describe a link that this is a link to the current page, which tells the user that they probably don't need to click it because it's the current page, and gives information about the location in a set of web pages. Or it can also give important information that's not visually available in your user interface. So you can use ARIA to enhance and build on top of your HTML implementation. You can use ARIA also to start from the scratch and develop your own UI elements and UI widgets, but this makes things a bit more complicated, and it's probably best to start with native HTML elements and build on top of that, and not build from scratch. But you can do that also with ARIA. So all elements that are available in HTML, you can also develop these elements from the scratch using ARIA techniques. So you describe, for example, a generic element, a div element, you give it a role of a button, and then make sure that it has a label, and all the other things are described using ARIA techniques. You can use ARIA to develop different types of UI elements. But when doing this, you need to make sure that you implement keyboard access according to the specifications. So you need to follow the specification carefully Keyboard functionality is there already for the native HTML elements, and that's why that approach is recommended. And using generic elements is generally advised to, well, you should probably rather use native HTML elements, but you can use also these if there's any reason that you cannot use native HTML elements, for example, based on the restrictions from your CMS or your UI framework that you're using. So how is ARIA used then? First of all, I already told that you should be following the ARIA specification when developing web content and UI widgets based on ARIA. So that's a very important reference on how to apply different roles, attributes, and techniques to your content. And you should follow the ARIA specification. The current version, or the recommended version to use is 1.2. That has most comprehensive support across different assistive technologies, different browsers. And then I'm going to refer a lot today to the ARIA authoring practice guide, which is just a quite recently published source of information that gives information about how to implement certain types of UI widgets in your content and how to apply ARIA to your components. And that's a very good reference. So for example, if you are aiming to implement a tab control on your website, then you should follow the patterns from the ARIA authoring practices guide. And this is something that I'm going to present you today also. So the first thing that you might want to use ARIA for is to give names and descriptions for your UI elements. There's a requirement in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines that you should label all your input elements. You should give them a so-called accessible name. And the accessible name should communicate the purpose of the element to your users. And usually this is done based on regular HTML elements. So you use the input tag to implement a text field, and then you use the label tag and associate the label tag to your input field, which gives the input element the accessible name, which describes how or what information should be filled in to the text field. And also the same applies to different kinds of UI elements, radio buttons, regular buttons, links, and so forth. So usually the accessible name is determined by the text content of the element or any other content. If there's a button that only has an icon, then if it's implemented using an image, using the image tag, then the text alternative for that image determines the accessible name for that button. But you can also use ARIA techniques to achieve that. So if you don't have any text visually available next to the field, then you can use ARIA techniques to give an accessible name to your component. So you can use the ARIA label attribute, which the value for that attribute can contain any text, and that text works as the name for the component. Or you can use ARIA label by, which is a reference to another element that contains some text, and that text describes your input element purpose or UI element purpose. You can also give descriptions to your elements. So for example, if there's a text field and you have instructions on how to fill in the field, then you can attach and associate those instructions to your input element using ARIA described by reference to that element which contains the textual information. And this is a good technique, especially if you don't have any text visually available in your UI you can use ARIA label to present text, and you can use ARIA labeled by references to associate text labels to your UI components, and you can use ARIA described by to associate instructions to your UI elements. But you should note that using these ARIA techniques overrides any previous labels that are determined by the element text content, for example, or the label tag. So you should be careful when using these. So as an example, what you would normally do when implementing a form field, you should use just a plain HTML solution. So you use input tag to implement the text field, and then use the label tag and associate that label tag using the for attribute to your input element. But you can also achieve that using just a generic div element, and you use ARIA labeled by reference from the input field to the text that contains the name for that element. You can reference the element's ID attribute. And you can also, if there's no text available, visual text in your UI that would work as a label for that input field, you can also use ARIA label attribute. You can also use ARIA label to override any visually available text if you want to give more information, but you need to make sure that you give at least the information that's visually available in your UI, in your ARIA labels. Then another thing that you can do with ARIA is mark up page regions. And this is important for people who don't see the web content. People who see the content determine the purpose of each part of the web page based on how it looks like. And the main content is in the middle, and the navigational structure is at the top or on the left. So you should be using ARIA landmarks to mark up the page regions. The preferable technique here also is to use HTML elements to do the same. So you use header element to mark up the top part of the page, nav element to mark up the navigational menu, main element to mark up main content, and so forth. And these should be used to mark up page content. So here also, preferable technique is to use HTML, and then if these cannot be used for some reason, then use ARIA roles. And if one landmark is used more than once, then you should also use ARIA labels to distinguish the different parts of the page from one another. So if there are several navigation menus, then you should label the navigation menus. And for also content structure, there are HTML elements that can be used for marking up headings, lists, links, buttons, tables, and content sections. And all these have ARIA equivalents. So you can use heading role with ARIA level attribute to mark up a heading with a generic element, but it's advisable to still use the HTML alternative because it's most compatible solution. Then you can use also ARIA to mark up different states of UI elements. So for example, marking the current link in a navigation menu, if it's visually highlighted, then it should be also available in the code. So using ARIA current attribute, which takes the value of page, step, date, or item, you can mark up the current page and give this attribute or assign this attribute to your current page link, which makes the screen reader tell the user that this is the current page. Also, you can use ARIA selected for certain UI elements. Using ARIA expanded, it is advisable if you have expanding content and so forth. So I'm going to give you some examples of how to apply these different techniques. This is just some examples from the ARIA guide. So these also all follow the same basic principles that come from the web content accessibility guidelines, that all UI elements that have a purpose on a web page and have any functionality, they should have a role assigned to them. So the component type should be specified. So it should be either the HTML element determines that, or you can use ARIA roles to do that. Different states should be available. So if it's expanded, collapsed, disabled, selected, checked, anything like that. And also, if it's an input element, also the current value should be available for assistive technologies. And ARIA gives a lot of techniques to achieve this. And if you implement any custom components to your website, you probably need to use ARIA techniques to present this information to assistive technologies. And you should refer to the ARIA practices guide on which attributes to use with different elements, and also refer to that guide for implementing the keyboard functionality. So how the element should respond to different keyboard commands. So for example, input elements should work with the arrow keys, and you should be able to select, for example, the current element in a list using the keyboard. So as an example, marking up these things to your code that uses generic elements, you should use semantic HTML. So in this example, you use the nav element or the button element to implement navigation menus and buttons within the navigation menu. Or you can use ARIA roles, but then you need to make sure that you also implement the keyboard functionality to your elements. If you use native HTML elements, that is automatically done for you. So you can use on-click attribute with the button element, and that works with the keyboard without any further code. So it's advisable for that reason also to use native HTML elements. It makes your life easier as a developer. So you can use on-click handlers for implementing the keyboard functionality also. Then you should give names for the elements, names or labels. So here, the nav element, the navigation menu, is labeled by using ARIA, labeled ARIA label, and here it's labeled as the primary menu of the website. And then in the menu, there are expanding and collapsing sections. These are marked up using the ARIA expanded attribute, which is either true or false, depending on whether the button is in the expanded or collapsed state. And there are a lot of examples in the ARIA guide that you can follow. There's information about how to use different roles, for example, how to implement different UI widgets, which roles to apply, which HTML elements to build upon, and then what markup needs to be present in the implementation. So for example, in an accordion, you should have heading elements which describe the content within the accordion. Then you should have a button element that's clickable using a screen reader with the mouse, using the keyboard. Also, it should be properly labeled, and the label should communicate what it actually does, what's the functionality. You should have information about whether it's expanded or collapsed using ARIA expanded attribute. And also you should mark up the content section of that part. So you should use a region role with a label which tells what's the purpose of this region. And the purpose of this is to give information for screen reader users that they know when the content area starts and when it ends. So you should also mark up the container part in the accordion. And the same principles can be applied to different types of UI widgets. So for example, a pop-up menu, if you have a button that opens up a menu, for example, the hamburger menu in a mobile UI is a good example of this. So you have a button which opens a menu, and you should implement the button preferably using the button element, give it a good label. If it has text, then that text should describe what's the functionality in that button, or if there's only an icon, then you should have either ARIA label or any hidden text or text alternative for that icon to communicate the purpose of the button. Then you should use ARIA to indicate that it opens a menu. So ARIA has pop-up attribute, does that. And then the menu itself, which is shown when the button is clicked, it should have a role associated to it. The menu area should be labeled. There should be keyboard functionalities implemented. So you should implement, for example, navigating through the menu items via the keyboard. You should have a visible focus indicator so that keyboard users know which element has the focus. The current element should be marked up if it's a navigation menu, and if you are on a subpage of the website, then the current page should be marked up using ARIA current. And also, if there's any hierarchy in the menu, that should be also present in the implementation. And there are a lot of examples on the web page. These are just some examples that I'm showing here. You can read through the guide, and I suggest that you familiarize yourself with the guide so that you get all the information. And there's really good examples in the current version of the guide. So for example, if you're aiming to implement a tab control, you should assign different roles to different sections of your tab control. So there should be a tab list that contains buttons which have the role of tab, and then they should work using the arrow keys. You select the tab that you want to activate using the arrow keys, and then you should also mark up the content panel of the tab, the changing content part of the tab control using a tab panel role. And also, one important thing is notifications and implementing and describing changing content in your web application, because especially web applications have changing parts of content, and screen readers don't tell users that a certain part of the page has changed if you don't use ARIA techniques to achieve that. So for example, for notifications that pop up on screen, you should use alert or status roles, which makes the screen reader read the alert when it's shown on screen. Or you can use this so-called live region, which makes the screen reader read changing content in a certain part of the page if you assign a ARIA live attribute to that. These are all documented in the guide, and I won't have time here to go through all the details, but it's also good to remember that if you have any changing content, there are different techniques for different types of UIs, different types of UI widgets you should follow. So as a recap, use native HTML elements if possible. If the functionality can be implemented using only native HTML elements, then do use that, and use, for example, elements for links, button elements for buttons, input elements for text fields, and so forth. They are most compatible, and they have the compatibility with different types of assistive technologies, different types of devices, and users are familiar with the native implementation of different types of widgets. For example, a select element looks a bit different in different browsers, looks a bit different in different on different mobile platforms also. So it's advisable to use the native implementation. And if there's no appropriate element available in HTML, for example, for tabs, there's no HTML element to implement tabs, or navigation menu, for example, then you should use ARIA, and then you should follow the ARIA specification or take the example from the ARIA practices guide and then follow that guide and build on top of that. So in the guide, there's HTML examples, JavaScript examples, and with CSS also. You can change the styling to be in line with your website visuals, but the technical implementation needs to be according to the ARIA specification and the ARIA practices example. So this is just a really brief and quick run through about how to use ARIA and how to apply ARIA techniques to different types of elements. I could go on for hours talking about this and talking about the details on how to implement different specific features to your custom components. And the ARIA guide is a very good reference, and I suggest that you read it through and then familiarize yourself with the examples. Good. So now we have time for the questions, and I will take the questions from the Q&A section and then answer these one by one. So the first question is about the ARIA specification compatibility with different types of assistive technologies, different screen readers, different browsers, different browser versions, and different combinations of different browsers and screen readers, for example. And they work in a bit different way based on the platform. And for example, Mac and Windows have some differences. Desktop platforms have differences compared to mobile platforms, and these work a bit differently. And I would suggest that there are a few websites. I will also add links to these websites. For example, accessibilitysupport.io is a good website that they have actually implemented tests on different browser screen reader combinations and which techniques are supported using different browsers, and you can use this as a reference. Some of the tests might not be carried out using the most recent versions of different browsers, but you can use this as a guideline and to give you an overview of which techniques are well supported and can be used, and then which are not that well supported and probably should be avoided, or you should maybe figure out a workaround for that. So this is a good reference, accessibilitysupport.io. And then another similar website is PowerMapper, which contains similar types of tests. The second part of the question was about whether we should work together to achieve better coverage for ARIA implementations. That's probably something we should be doing. The situation is improving constantly, so browsers and screen readers are implementing the new ARIA features one by one, slowly, but gradually the situation is improving. Although when there are new websites and new technologies coming up and new design patterns are emerging, then it's a bit the implementation doesn't necessarily keep up with the development always, but for most UI widgets, for example, there were a lot of problems with combo box implementations just a few years ago, and nowadays it's way better. The situation is much better, but it's not perfect. And there are certain UI elements that don't have any browser support or any screen reader support at the moment. So you need to do some testing, make sure that your implementation works, at least with the major browsers and most common browsers. But of course, it's best to use technologies and techniques that are usable with most combinations. Then Eetu is asking whether ARIA attributes or roles can be used for defining the visual appearance of a component in CSS. So for example, you can use or you would catch the ARIA current attribute in CSS and then apply different styles to that element using CSS and using the ARIA attribute. That probably is a good idea. It doesn't make any difference regarding, for example, screen reader compatibility, whether you do that in CSS or not, but it certainly helps with the implementation that you don't forget using ARIA techniques and don't forget marking up the current page if you can see it visually also immediately whether the attribute is in place or not. So might be a good idea to do that. But overall, you should at least couple those things. So if you apply a certain class to your active element, then you should also apply the ARIA attribute to that same element. And you can use the same logic that you already have in place in your code for those things.
So there are no more questions. So and it's 1 minute to 2 o'clock. So I think we can just finish here. Thank you so much, Timo, for sharing your knowledge and giving us all the examples and tips. And thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. And I hope I'll see you all on the 16th of June during our next webinar. Thank you so much. Take care. Have a nice weekend for those who we're gonna have a long weekend now, at least as in Sweden. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Take care. Bye.